There's a tiny dot on the map that's easy to miss. At the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, the bottom edge of Southeast Asia, an island less than half the size of New York City. No oil, no gold, no farmland, not enough fresh water to survive on its own. When this country declared independence in 1965, its neighbors said one thing: that country won't last a year. Economists shook their heads. A nation with no natural resources cannot survive. That was the consensus. But today, Singapore's GDP per capita is higher than the United States. How was this even possible? The story starts 200 years ago. 1819, a man working for the British East India Company stepped off a small boat at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, Stamford Raffles. At the time, the island was home to about 1,000 Malay fishermen. Most of it was jungle, malaria mosquitoes everywhere. Raffles stepped ashore and looked around, and he was certain, this is the place. Why here? Look at a map and it becomes obvious. The exact point where the Indian Ocean meets the Pacific. The one passage every ship traveling from Europe to China had to pass through. At the time, the global trade was built on spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, things Europeans risked their lives to obtain. And right in the middle of that trade route sat this island. Raffles struck a deal with the local Malay Sultan. Britain would use the land as a trading port. In return, the Sultan would receive payment. One condition: free trade, no taxes. Any ship from any country could dock freely. That single decision changed everything. Word spread fast. A port with no taxes. Chinese merchants came, Indian traders came, Arab merchants came, European trading companies came. The population of 1,000 in 1819 surpassed 10,000 within 5 years, 20,000 a decade later. Jungle became harbor, warehouses went up, banks opened, streets were laid down. Within just a few years of Raffles declaring it a free port, Singapore had become the busiest harbor in Southeast Asia. An island with nothing had become the hub of world trade, on location alone. Through the rest of the 19th century, Singapore kept growing. The Suez Canal opened in 1869. Travel time from Europe to Asia was cut in half. The number of ships passing through Singapore doubled, then tripled. Rubber plantations spread across the Malay Peninsula, and Singapore was the gateway through which that rubber reached the world. Tin from nearby mines shipped out through Singapore's port. The island itself had nothing, but everything around it flowed through it. Singapore grew wealthy as a British colony. Then, December 1941, the world changed. The same day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed on the northern coast of the Malay Peninsula. Their target was Singapore. Britain was confident. Singapore was impregnable, they said. They called it the Gibraltar of the East. Massive coastal gun batteries lined the shore. Any enemy coming by sea would be stopped. But Japan didn't come by sea. They came through the jungle. They rode bicycles down the Malay Peninsula, 700 kilometers. The British never imagined an army could push through that jungle. In 55 days, Japanese forces reached the island just north of Singapore. February 8, 1942. Japanese troops crossed the Johor Strait. The British fought back, but it was already too late. The water supply was cut. Shells hit the hospitals. Fires broke out across the city. British Commander General Percival faced an impossible choice: keep fighting and civilians die. February 15, 1942. General Percival walked toward the Japanese commander carrying a white flag. 85,000 British soldiers surrendered, the largest surrender in British military history. Churchill reportedly couldn't speak when he heard the news. For the people of Singapore, this moment meant something different. They watched the most powerful empire in the world collapse right in front of them. The belief that Britain would protect them vanished in an instant. During 3 years of Japanese occupation, the people of Singapore endured devastating hardship. Food ran out. Forced labor was imposed. Tens of thousands lost their lives. And through all of it, many people began thinking the same thought: we have to protect ourselves. The seed of independence had been planted. 1945. The war ended. Britain came back. But it wasn't the same. Britain's authority had already collapsed. Independence movements ignited across Asia. Singapore was no different. In 1959, Singapore gained self-governance from Britain, and in that election, one man won by a landslide to become Prime Minister. Lee Kuan Yew, 36 years old, a lawyer who graduated top of his class from Cambridge. He had one deep conviction about Singapore's future: we cannot survive alone. So Lee Kuan Yew pursued a merger with Malaysia. 1963. Singapore became part of Malaysia, but within 2 years, everything fell apart. Tensions between the Malaysian government and Singapore's leadership reached a breaking point. Malaysia wanted policies that prioritized the Malay ethnic majority. Singapore wanted meritocracy. Racial conflict erupted. Riots broke out in the streets. August 9, 1965. The Malaysian parliament held a vote: expel Singapore from Malaysia. 126 votes in favor, 0 against. Singapore became independent, not because it wanted to, because it was forced to. That afternoon, Lee Kuan Yew sat down in front of a TV camera. Tears ran down his face. "We are going to survive." His voice broke. He was crying. These were not tears of joy. The numbers tell you everything about what Singapore was facing. Unemployment at 14%, population of 1.9 million, no military, no resources, not even enough fresh water without buying it from Malaysia. Neighboring countries were watching closely. Indonesia had territorial claims over Singapore. Economists said it again: this country will not survive. Lee Kuan Yew had no time. He had no options. So he went in a direction nobody expected. The first thing Lee Kuan Yew did was not look for enemies outside. He looked inside. The biggest problem he identified in Singapore was not the lack of resources. It was corruption. At the time, nothing in Singapore worked without a bribe. You paid the police. You paid to get permits approved. Lee Kuan Yew asked himself one question: would any foreign company invest here, in a country run on bribes? The answer was obvious: eliminate corruption. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau had already existed since 1952. Lee Kuan Yew expanded its power dramatically. Ministers, judges, anyone could be investigated. No one was above it. And he raised civil servant salaries dramatically. The logic was simple. People take bribes because they aren't paid enough. Pay them well, and they have no reason to. Singapore's ministerial salaries eventually became among the highest in the world. The results showed. By the 1990s, Singapore had become the least corrupt country in Asia. But eliminating corruption wasn't enough. Lee Kuan Yew had a bigger problem: people. 1.9 million people. That was the only resource Singapore had. The question was what to do with them. His answer was radical: change the language. At the time, Singapore was a Tower of Babel. Chinese Singaporeans spoke Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka. Malay Singaporeans spoke Malay. Indian Singaporeans spoke Tamil. People in the same country couldn't talk to each other. Lee Kuan Yew made a decision. All schools would teach in English. The backlash was fierce. The Chinese community rose up in protest. "You're taking away our language." Lee Kuan Yew didn't back down. This is not about sentiment. This is about survival. If we want to do business with the world, we need the world's language. That decision completely transformed Singapore's future. A decade later, Singapore's young people spoke English as naturally as a first language. For foreign companies, Singapore became the obvious choice. A country in Asia where English works, where there's no corruption, where the law actually functions. But to attract foreign companies, one more thing was needed: somewhere for people to live. In the 1960s, Singapore was covered in slums. A third of the population lived in shanty towns. No electricity, no running water. Lee Kuan Yew established the Housing Development Board, HDB. One goal: give every Singaporean a home. Within 10 years, 100,000 public housing units had been built. But Lee Kuan Yew didn't just build houses. This is where the genius came in. He didn't give the homes away. He made them buyable. The Central Provident Fund, CPF. A portion of every paycheck was automatically saved, and that money could be used to buy a home. The result was that 90% of Singaporeans ended up owning their own home. Why does this matter? When people own a home, they don't leave. They want to protect the country their home is in. They become more deeply connected to the economy. One apartment became an anchor tying citizens to the nation. The 1970s. Singapore now needed something to sell. No resources, no agriculture. The only things it could offer were location and people. Lee Kuan Yew traveled the world. He went to American companies. He made his case to European firms. Build your factory in Singapore. No corruption. English works here. We have a port. We'll give you tax incentives. At first, there was no response. Who was going to trust this tiny country? Then one company came, Texas Instruments, an American semiconductor company. 1968, they built a factory in Singapore. It went well. Word spread. HP came. General Electric came. Philips came. Throughout the 1970s, the world's leading companies opened factories in Singapore. Unemployment dropped from 14% to 5%, then to 3%. Singaporeans had jobs. They earned wages. They spent money. The economy started moving. But Lee Kuan Yew didn't stop there. Factories weren't enough. Factories can always move to a cheaper country. When wages rise, they leave. Singapore couldn't stay cheap forever. It had to move up. The 1980s. Singapore shifted direction, from manufacturing to finance. Geography became an advantage again. When London closes, Singapore opens. When Singapore closes, New York opens. Singapore sat at the center of the world's financial time zones. An Asian dollar market was created. Foreign banks were brought in. Citibank, HSBC, Deutsche Bank. The world's major banks set up their Asian headquarters in Singapore. And then there was Changi Airport. Opened in 1981, built with one ambition, to be the best airport in the world. From its very first year, it started winning Best Airport awards. Decades later, it still holds that title. One airport became the face of an entire nation. This is what Singapore looks like. 1990, Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as Prime Minister. He had held the position for 31 years. When he left office, Singapore's GDP per capita was more than 30 times what it had been at independence. The world took notice. How was this possible? A country with no resources, barely any land, a tiny population. But not everyone was applauding the Singapore model. The criticism was loud. No freedom of the press. Political opposition was not tolerated. Lee Kuan Yew's People's Action Party had held power for decades without interruption. Opposition politicians faced lawsuits. The media was controlled. Chewing gum was banned. Critics said it plainly. Singapore is economically free, but politically it is not. Lee Kuan Yew responded to this criticism directly. Western-style democracy does not necessarily work in Asia. We have our own way. Who was right is still being debated. Does economic success justify the absence of political freedom? The answer depends on who you ask. Look at Singapore today, and the numbers speak for themselves. GDP per capita of $80,000, higher than the United States. One of the safest cities in the world. One of the least corrupt countries in the world. One of the most efficient governments in the world. Second busiest port on Earth. Best airport in the world. Education ranked among the top globally. But we have to go back to the question we started with. How was this possible? No oil, no gold, no land, no water. The answer is actually simple. Singapore didn't obsess over what it lacked. It focused on what it had. It had location, it had people, and it pushed both of those things as far as they could go. It eliminated corruption to build trust. It changed its language to connect with the world. It invested in education to turn people into resources. It gave people homes so they wouldn't leave. And it always looked ahead to what the world was going to need next. In the age of trade, it became a port. In the age of manufacturing, it became a factory. In the age of finance, it became a hub. It reinvented itself with every era. In 1965, Lee Kuan Yew said through tears, "We are going to survive." That turned out to be an understatement. It didn't just survive, it became one of the centers of the world, a tiny island that had nothing. Right now, at this very moment, 200,000 people pass through Changi Airport every single day. At the port of Singapore, ships from every country on Earth load and unload their cargo. In the towers of Marina Bay, the money of the world is moving. Just as Stamford Raffles stood in the jungle in 1819 and saw something nobody else could see, Singapore in 2025 is the full realization of that vision. You don't need resources. It's not about what you have. It's about what you do with what you have. Singapore proved it.